Hello and welcome to our final set of notes in Unit 2 on industrialization. In this set of notes we'll be talking about working conditions in those factories that we've been talking about, the labor unions and strikes that arose because of those working conditions. By the end of these notes you'll want to be able to explain reasons for the growth of these organized labor organizations. You'll want to list issues these labor organizations sought to address, so addressing those working conditions, and then explain the results of 4 major strikes. So you'll need to know the details of those and then the results. So let's talk about these working conditions. Child labor was rampant at the time, and we see this all throughout our country due to industrialization. Children as young as 6 years old were working 12 to 14-hour days on heavy, dangerous machines. And oftentimes these kids were so small that they would have to climb to the top, whether it was to change thread or do some kind of maintenance. These children were paid a fraction of what adults were paid, and orphans oftentimes were not paid at all. So you see a couple more pictures here. This one down here is boys working in a coal mine. And you see these slave drive-like figures, these adults here, that would prod and beat the boys to get them to work at faster paces in the coal mines. And you might say, like, why would parents do this? Well, at the time, they had no choice. They were living in squalor, right? They were living in very poor conditions, and financially they had no other choice but to send their kids to work to earn money, even for the little that they earned. So this is Manuel, a young shrimp picker. He is 5 years old. There's this mountain of oyster shells behind him, and he is a child working on picking shrimp. But here's the thing, the working conditions were bad for adults too. It was very unsanitary, so unhealthy, unclean conditions for very low and unfair wages. When we saw at this time the tycoons of the various industries, the owners, the businessmen, are making the big bucks, right? So these people, the factory workers, were making such unfairly low wages, and the businessmen were making boatloads. So we see this huge disparity in how the rich were living versus how the poor were living. So here's Andrew Carnegie, who made over $20 million in 1 year. $20 million. Whereas, the wages of a child was 27 cents a day in the same year. For women, they made $267 a year to Carnegie's $20 million, and men making $498. So they had no breaks, there was no workers' compensation, no paid vacation, and they were working every day of the week in most cases. So all this money, like I said, leads to this huge disparity in their living conditions. So this is Andrew Carnegie's summer home. And this is oftentimes where we saw the factory workers living in these tenement buildings that had no windows most of the time, one room apartments essentially for 6+ people living in it. So as a result of all of these poor working conditions, we see the rise of labor unions. These workers get together. So we have this rise. And what is a labor union? Well, it's this unity of people, of laborers, right? It's an organized group of workers formed to protect their rights in the workplace. So we see them come together as a way to increase and improve those working for better work conditions. So some issues, and you want to have down at least 3 here, is low pay. They have incredibly long hours, so a 12-hour workday, 6 to 7 days a week. There's no vacation or sick. Again, those unsafe working conditions, so we see a lot of injuries, a lot of health issues, and of course, any kind of child labor is bad. But through years and years and years of hard work and the presence of labor unions, which we'll talk about here, we come to these solutions that we now have today. So again, it took many years, but it all comes out of the work. These solutions all come out of the work of the labor unions. And we now have a minimum wage. We have an 8-hour workday instead of a 12 plus. We do have paid vacation and sick days, safer work conditions. There's lots of rules, laws, and regulations there, and no or even restricted child labor. So we've got to talk about these specific labor unions, the first one being the Knights of Labor. And they were formed in 1869, and they advocated for these things here: an 8-hour workday, equal pay for women, which was something that made them very different from the other groups, and they didn't discriminate here, and that they were rather progressive at this time in the sense that they allowed both women and blacks to join this labor union. They advocated for no child labor, and they actually opposed strikes, instead favoring arbitration. And you'll want to jot down that arbitration is when, they advocated for arbitration, which is having a third party, a person that is not related to the two parties that are arguing or trying to come to a consensus, that comes in to help negotiate with those two parties. The American Federation of Labor is the next union that you need to know about, also known as the AFL. The founder was Samuel Gompers, and this group was more moderate than the Knights of Labor. They focused on skilled workers, and at first they were founded in 1886, but they advocated for or focused on skilled workers. So they could advocate for better pay because those skilled workers required training, but that also limited their membership to white men, because white men were the ones who had access to that training in order to be skilled workers. So again, advocating for better pay, better working hours, and safer working conditions. They advocated for something called closed shops, which is where employers only hire union workers. And they did advocate for strikes, which is where the workers walk off the job. The last group we'll talk about is the Industrial Workers of the World, also known as IWW. The founder is Eugene Debs, who was a long member of the labor movement and actually went on to run for president a couple of times. And it was founded in 1905. It is the most radical of the three labor unions we're discussing here, in that they were made up of mostly socialists, and that they did not believe in capitalism, and many of them were anarchists and not believing in that organized form of government that kind of brought people down in their eyes. Their nickname was the Wobblies. They were made up of skilled and unskilled workers, and they very much favored strikes. So again, the workers walking off the job. So this map here shows you that out of these labor unions, we see at this time a lot of various strikes, many of them, if not all of them, resulting in some sort of violence. And we see that, as you can see on this map here, all over the country. And so that's where we're going to talk now, and in our notes is what happened with these strikes. And you've got to know the four major ones. So the Great Railroad Strike of 1877, it's important for you to know in your brain, but also note on your paper that in 1873, America suffered from an economic downturn at the time. And so as a result, the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad Company cut workers' wages for the third time. Okay, so they, not just for the first time, for the third time they cut workers' wages. So workers then strike. They walk off the job. They actively smash railroad equipment. They stand on the railroad tracks in the way of the trains, not letting them, pass. There ends up being 80,000 participants, and it impacted 2/3 of the railroads across the country because of their activity. So as a result, the president actually sends in federal troops to end the strike, and violence erupts at that point between these police officers, these federal troops. There's 12 days of fighting, 12 days, and at the end, 100 are dead, and there's $10 million in damage. So what's the result here? The public is absolutely shocked at the violence. They want peace, and this is where the public starts to associate labor unions with violence. The Haymarket riot in 1886, it's called a riot rather than a strike because it started as a peaceful protest for an 8-hour workday. So these workers showed up to say we're peacefully protesting because we're just advocating for an 8-hour workday. Well, on the first day, police kill 4 protesters. So the next day when protesters come back, tensions are very high. Someone throws a bomb at the police officers, killing 10 police officers and wounding 170. And from that point, violence erupts. So again, the result here being that it makes unions look even more radical in the public's mind. And whether justly or unjustly, one of those labor unions we talked about, the Knights of Labor, is blamed. So their membership numbers actually steeply decrease after the Haymarket riot. The Homestead Strike in 1892 is the next one. This is involving steelworkers in Pennsylvania. And Henry Clay Frick, who actually worked for Carnegie, or the steel tycoon at the time, he cuts steelworkers' wages by 20%. So he's like the manager, right? By 20%. So at that point, workers walk off the job. But when they do that, Frick locks them out. And he sends in Pinkertons. Pinkertons are a private security agency, and they actually replace the workers. So the work is still being done without the people who are striking, advocating for better working conditions and pay. So violent fighting ensues between the Pinkertons and the workers. So after some of the fighting goes on, the workers go back to work, all just to be released, to be fired by Frick at the end of the day. So again, the fighting stops, workers go back to work for a day, and Frick fires all of them. So this was an epic fail of the strike because, again, they ultimately went back to work for the same conditions and then lost their jobs. Finally, we're talking about the Pullman strike in 1894. This was also in Chicago. And Pullman was a man who made these luxury railroad cars for the rich who were traveling across the country. So Pullman lowered wages to where workers who were creating these luxury cars couldn't pay rent. So he lowered them so low that they couldn't pay rent at the time. So workers walk off the job, they strike. And this strike and boycott ends up spreading across the country. To a point where President Cleveland at the time sends federal troops again, and yet again violence erupts. So the strike and boycott actually lasts from May to August, and it was actually organized by the American Railroad Union, and that was led by Eugene Debs at the time. So what ends up happening, the federal court actually issues a formal order to stop the boycott. And what this shows us is that the government at the time is actively against labor unions, so very much hurting their cause. And the president, however, at the time, to appease workers and to maybe prevent some of these strikes, he signs into a national holiday, Labor Day. So the Pullman strike is actually why I think it's the first Monday in September we have off work. So those are the 4 big strikes you need to know about in the labor unions. Make sure you answer the summary questions on your guided notes and get a stamp from your teacher when you're finished.